Firearms did not appear overnight. They were not born in a single invention, or in a single country. What we call the gun today is the result of centuries of experimentation, shaped by war, empire, and the spread of technology across continents. The story begins in China, where gunpowder was first developed more than 1,000 years ago. At first, it was not a firearm at all. It was used in explosives, fireworks, and primitive military devices long before anyone imagined the modern gun. The first true firearms were simple and crude, metal tubes mounted on wooden shafts, loaded with powder and a projectile, then ignited by hand. They were known as hand cannons. And by the 13th century they had begun appearing in warfare across Asia. From there, the technology moved west, through trade routes, conquest, and cultural exchange, reaching the Middle East and Europe. Once it arrived, it began changing warfare in ways earlier generations could barely imagine. Fortresses that had stood for centuries fell to artillery. Armored knights lost their battlefield advantage. Entire military systems had to adapt. Over the centuries, those crude tubes evolved into matchlocks, muskets, rifled weapons, revolvers, and eventually the industrial firearms that defined the modern age. Each generation made them faster, more reliable, and more transformative. This is not just the history of a weapon. It is the story of a technology that reshaped kingdoms, expanded empires, changed the outcome of wars, and altered the balance of power across the world. From black powder and bronze tubes to machines that changed modern history. This is how firearms evolved. Fire lances in medieval China. Firearms did not begin as sleek metal weapons or battlefield rifles. Their earliest form was far more primitive, and far more unexpected. During the Song dynasty in China, around the 10th to 12th centuries, soldiers began using one of the first known gunpowder weapons, the fire lance. These early devices combined a simple spear with a bamboo or metal tube packed with gunpowder. When ignited, they produced bursts of flame, smoke, and sometimes scattered debris toward an enemy at very close range. At first, the fire lance was not a gun in the modern sense. It was more like a shock weapon, used to break enemy formations at short distance, combining fire, noise, and sudden impact to create confusion on the battlefield. But over time, the design began to change. The bamboo tubes were reinforced with metal. The gunpowder mixtures improved. And some versions started launching small projectiles along with the flame. What began as a mounted spear with an explosive burst slowly evolved into something new. A step toward the first true firearms. And in that evolution, a major shift began. War was no longer defined only by blades and arrows. A new force had entered the battlefield, one built from chemistry, pressure, and fire. This is how firearms evolved. They were not born as the weapons we recognize today, but as something far more primitive, shaped slowly by trial, error, and centuries of innovation. It begins with black powder in ancient China, a discovery that would quietly change the balance of power across continents. From there, knowledge moved west. Along trade routes, through empires, and across centuries of conflict and exchange, reaching the Islamic world and eventually Europe, where it would be refined, redefined, and transformed into entirely new forms of warfare. What started as crude fire tubes and early explosive devices gradually evolved into more advanced weapon systems, each step building on the last, each generation pushing the limits of what was possible. And with every transformation, warfare itself began to change. This is not just a story of invention. It is a story of movement, of ideas crossing borders, reshaping empires, and accelerating the course of history. Hand cannons. They did not begin as refined weapons, nor as symbols of power. They began as something far simpler, and far more uncertain. By the 13th and 14th centuries, early gunpowder technology had evolved into crude metal tubes mounted on wooden grips, known today as hand cannons. These were among the first true handheld firearms used across Eurasia. Unlike later firearms, these early weapons were not precise. There were no sights, no standardized bullets, and no predictable accuracy. They were simple iron or bronze tubes that ignited gunpowder to launch a projectile, or sometimes just a burst of flame and noise, to shock and disrupt enemy formations. The earliest forms appeared in China and gradually spread across Eurasia through trade networks, warfare, and technological exchange. By the early 14th century, similar weapons were being recorded in parts of Europe as well. On the battlefield, their effect was not about precision. It was about impact. Smoke. Fire. Thunder-like noise. Confusion. Armies that had relied on bows, crossbows, and steel suddenly faced something entirely new. And although these early hand cannons were crude, heavy, and unreliable, they marked a turning point. Because once a soldier could carry the force of an explosion in their hands, warfare would never remain the same. This was only the beginning. Matchlock mechanism. The earliest firearms were powerful, but awkward. To fire them, soldiers often had to ignite powder by hand, exposing themselves in the process. That changed with the matchlock. By the 15th century, gunsmiths developed a mechanical firing system that made firearms far more practical for organized armies. A slow-burning cord, called a match, was clamped into a lever. When the trigger was pulled, the glowing match lowered into a small pan of gunpowder, igniting the main charge inside the barrel. This created one of the first true trigger mechanisms in firearm history. That may sound simple now, but it was a major step. A firearm no longer needed to be lit manually at the barrel. The shooter could aim and fire in a more controlled way, making coordinated volleys possible. Matchlock firearms like the arquebus and early muskets began appearing across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. Soldiers could now be trained to use gunpowder weapons in formation, turning firearms into a practical part of military strategy rather than rare experimental tools. This changed how armies fought. The system still had flaws. Rain could extinguish the match. Wind could expose a position. The glowing cord made stealth impossible at night, but none of that stopped its spread. Because for the first time, firing a gun was no longer just about lighting powder. It had become a repeatable mechanical action. And once firearms became practical for entire armies, the age of gunpowder warfare truly began. Arquebus Revolution. For centuries, heavy armor defined elite warfare. Steel-covered cavalry dominated battlefields, and the armored knight remained a symbol of military power. Then came the arquebus. By the 15th and 16th centuries, this early shoulder-fired firearm began changing the balance between mounted elites and infantry. It was not the first gun, but it was one of the first to become widely effective in organized warfare. The arquebus could penetrate some forms of armor at practical battlefield ranges, especially as powder quality improved. That did not make armor disappear overnight, but it changed the calculation. Armor became heavier in response, then increasingly impractical as firearms improved further. This shift gave ordinary infantry a much greater role. A trained foot soldier with an arquebus could threaten armored cavalry that once dominated through cost, training, and social status. Armies adapted quickly. Firearms were integrated into formations alongside pikemen, creating combined tactics that challenged older medieval warfare. Battles were no longer decided only by cavalry charges or swordsmanship, but by discipline, timing, and coordinated volleys. The knight did not vanish in a single battle. But the arquebus began eroding the system that made the knight dominant. And with that, warfare moved further from the medieval world. Toward the age of standing armies, gunpowder tactics, and the modern battlefield. Muskets replace older weapons. The arquebus opened the door. The musket changed the world. By the 16th century, larger and more powerful firearms began replacing many earlier gunpowder weapons on European battlefields. Muskets were heavier, longer-ranged, and capable of delivering enough force to challenge armor more reliably than earlier designs. At first, muskets were so heavy that many required a support rest, a forked stand planted in the ground before firing. Reloading remained slow, and accuracy was limited. But in mass formations, individual precision mattered less than coordinated volleys. This changed warfare at scale. Armies began organizing thousands of infantry around musket fire, often combining them with pikemen for protection during the long reload process. The result was a new kind of battlefield discipline, rows of soldiers firing in sequence, reloading, and firing again as part of a coordinated system. The effects reached beyond Europe. As European empires expanded, muskets traveled with them, across the Americas, Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. Firearms became part of conquest, colonial warfare, and imperial control. Older weapons did not disappear immediately. Swords, spears, and cavalry remained important for generations. But the center of military power had shifted. Once muskets became standard, empires could arm large standing armies with relatively standardized weapons, and that changed how states fought, expanded, and ruled. The gun was no longer an experiment. It had become the backbone of empire. Flintlock era. Early firearms changed warfare, but they were still difficult to trust. A matchlock needed a burning cord to fire. In rain, wind, or darkness, that glowing fuse could fail, or reveal a soldier's position before the shot was fired. Then came the flintlock. By the 17th century, flintlock mechanisms began replacing older match systems and became the dominant ignition method for firearms across much of the world. Instead of a burning match, the weapon used a piece of flint striking steel to create sparks, igniting the powder automatically when the trigger was pulled. This was a major improvement in reliability. No exposed flame. Faster handling. Easier movement. Better performance in military formations. The flintlock made firearms more practical not just for battle, but for hunting, naval combat, and colonial expansion. It became the standard for muskets and pistols used by European empires during the 17th and 18th centuries, including wars that shaped continents. It also changed battlefield tactics. Armies could move more efficiently, maintain better readiness, and rely less on specialized support for firing systems. The flintlock did not make guns modern by itself. But it made them dependable enough to dominate. And once firearms became reliable in nearly every environment, they stopped being new technology, and became the foundation of global military power. Colonial expansion. Firearms changed more than battlefields. They changed maps. As European powers expanded across the world from the 16th century onward, firearms became one of the technologies that supported conquest, colonization, and frontier control. Muskets and artillery did not guarantee victory by themselves. But they often gave invading armies a major advantage in key encounters. In the Americas, Africa, and parts of Asia, firearms were used alongside ships, cavalry, fortifications, and alliances with local groups. Empires relied on more than weapons. But firearms gave soldiers range, shock, and military organization that could alter the balance of power. This did not mean every conquest was easy or one-sided. Many indigenous states and local powers resisted effectively, adapted to firearms themselves, or acquired guns through trade. In some regions, firearms spread rapidly among non-European forces and changed local conflicts as well. Still, gunpowder weapons accelerated expansion. Fortified ports became colonial footholds. Trade routes became military corridors. Frontier settlements expanded behind armed garrisons and imperial armies. The weapon had evolved again. It was no longer only a battlefield tool between rival armies. It had become part of how empires projected power across oceans, reshaping borders, societies, and the course of global history. And as industry advanced, firearms were about to change even faster. Rifling changes accuracy. For centuries, firearms were powerful, but imprecise. Early smoothbore muskets fired round projectiles that bounced unpredictably inside the barrel and quickly lost stability after leaving it. At typical battlefield distances, accuracy was limited, and soldiers relied on mass volleys rather than precision. Then a quiet but crucial innovation changed everything: rifling. By cutting spiral grooves inside the barrel, gunsmiths discovered they could make the projectile spin as it fired. That spin stabilized its flight, keeping it straighter for longer distances and dramatically improving accuracy and effective range. At first, rifled weapons were slow to adopt. The tighter fit between bullet and barrel made loading more difficult than smoothbore muskets, limiting their early military use. For a long time, armies still preferred faster-firing muskets for mass formations. But the advantage was undeniable. Rifled firearms allowed skilled shooters to engage targets at distances that were previously impossible. This began shifting certain roles on the battlefield, from mass infantry fire toward specialized marksmen and early forms of sharpshooting. By the 19th century, improvements in ammunition design solved many of the early loading problems, and rifling became increasingly standard in military rifles. This marked a turning point. Firearms were no longer just area weapons, they were becoming precision tools. And with that change, warfare began to shift again. Less about volume of fire, and more about distance, accuracy, and control. Revolver innovation. For centuries, firearms shared one major limitation: after a single shot, they had to be reloaded. That pause shaped everything: tactics, survival, and the rhythm of combat. In the early 19th century, that changed with the rise of the revolver. The key innovation was simple but transformative: a rotating cylinder that held multiple chambers. After each shot, the cylinder indexed to the next chamber, allowing several consecutive shots before reloading. One of the most influential early designs came from Samuel Colt, whose production methods helped make revolvers more widely available and consistent. His designs played a major role in spreading repeating handguns during the mid-1800s. On the battlefield, and in frontier environments, the impact was immediate. A single individual no longer depended on one shot and a long reload cycle. Instead, revolvers offered multiple rapid shots in close-range encounters, changing personal defense and small-unit combat dynamics. This did not replace rifles or muskets in armies overnight. But it introduced something new: sustained firepower in a handheld weapon. It also changed perception. Firearms were no longer just single-action tools of opportunity. They were becoming mechanisms of repeated force. And as industrial manufacturing advanced, the idea of repeating fire would not stop at revolvers. It would continue evolving, toward weapons capable of even faster, more controlled, and more sustained fire than ever before. Industrial production. For centuries, firearms were made one at a time. A gunsmith crafted each weapon by hand. And parts often varied so much that pieces from one gun would not fit another. Repair was slow. Production was limited. Armies depended on craftsmanship as much as supply. Then factories changed everything. During the 19th century, industrial manufacturing introduced standardized production and interchangeable parts. Firearms could now be produced on assembly lines, with components designed to fit across large numbers of identical weapons. This was more than a manufacturing improvement. It changed warfare itself. A state could now equip large standing armies with standardized rifles, replacement parts, and ammunition at a scale that earlier empires could not match. Weapons became easier to repair, maintain, and replace during long campaigns. Factories like Springfield Armory and companies such as Colt's Manufacturing Company helped develop methods that influenced industry far beyond firearms. Precision machining and interchangeable parts became central to modern manufacturing. The result was a new era. The gun was no longer only a crafted object, it had become an industrial product. And once weapons could be produced in factories by the tens of thousands, war itself became more industrial, more scalable, and far more destructive than before. Breech loading. For centuries, soldiers loaded firearms from the front of the barrel. Powder, projectile, ramrod, step by step, all from the muzzle. It was slow, awkward, and often dangerous under battlefield pressure. Then came breech loading. Instead of loading from the front, breech loading firearms were loaded from the rear of the barrel, closer to the firing chamber. That simple change dramatically increased firing speed and made reloading easier, especially while lying down or taking cover. This was one of the major military shifts of the 19th century. With breech-loading rifles, trained soldiers could fire more shots in less time, reducing the vulnerability created by long reload cycles. It also made better use of cover and changed battlefield positioning. Infantry no longer had to stand in exposed lines just to reload efficiently. Weapons such as the Drey's needle gun showed how quickly the technology could influence warfare. In conflicts like the Austro-Prussian War, faster-firing rifles gave armies significant tactical advantages. The shift was not just about speed. It altered military doctrine. Tight formations began to break apart. Cover became more important. Accuracy and rate of fire started to matter more than sheer massed ranks. The muzzle-loaded era had lasted for centuries. But once soldiers could reload from the rear, the pace of warfare accelerated, and the modern rifle was getting closer. Repeating rifles. For centuries, soldiers fired one shot at a time. Then came repeating rifles. Instead of reloading after every shot, these weapons stored multiple cartridges inside a magazine. With the pull of a lever or the movement of a bolt, another round was ready almost instantly. The difference on the battlefield was enormous. During the American Civil War, rifles like the Spencer repeater allowed some Union troops to fire far faster than traditional muzzle-loading soldiers. A single rifleman could suddenly deliver sustained fire that once required several men. Soon, repeating systems spread across the world. Lever-action rifles became famous in the American frontier. But many armies eventually turned toward bolt-action designs. They were stronger, more reliable, and better suited for the new high-velocity ammunition appearing in the late 1800s. Weapons like the Mauser and Lee Enfield transformed infantry combat. Soldiers could fire faster, reload more efficiently, and fight effectively at far greater distances than previous generations. Popular culture often focuses on the image of the Wild West lever-action rifle. But historically, the bolt-action rifle became the true foundation of modern military firearms. By the beginning of the 20th century, the age of the single-shot rifle was fading away. Modern warfare was becoming faster, deadlier, and increasingly industrial. Machine gun era. War was no longer becoming more personal. It was becoming industrial. In the late 1800s, early machine guns changed the battlefield forever. Unlike older weapons that required constant reloading, these guns could fire hundreds of rounds per minute using automatic systems powered by recoil or gas pressure. The most famous was the Maxim gun, introduced in the 1880s, the world's first truly reliable automatic machine gun. A small crew could now produce the firepower of dozens of riflemen. At first, many military leaders underestimated what this meant. Popular culture often imagines machine guns as sudden inventions of World War I. But the technology had already proven devastating in colonial wars and conflicts before 1914. Then came the trenches. During World War I, machine guns dominated open ground with relentless fire. Infantry charges that once relied on courage and numbers were suddenly torn apart in seconds. Soldiers dug deeper into trenches, and warfare became slower, deadlier, and mechanical. The battlefield was changing into a machine of mass production. World War I. Modern warfare changed forever with the arrival of the Great War. World War I began with strategies still rooted in the 19th century, but it quickly became something entirely new. The myth is that armies were simply unprepared. In reality, they were prepared for the wrong kind of war. Early offensives still relied on movement, formation, and speed. But across the Western Front, firepower had already overtaken mobility. Machine guns, rapid artillery, and barbed wire turned open ground into a killing zone. So soldiers dug in. Trench lines stretched for hundreds of kilometers. The battlefield froze into a landscape of mud, concrete, and steel. Advances became measured in meters, not miles. But war didn't stop evolving. Artillery became the dominant force, striking far beyond the front line. Coordinated barrages attempted to lift fire forward in creeping waves. Tanks appeared later in the war, designed to cross trenches and break stalemates. Aircraft moved from reconnaissance to combat roles in the sky above. It was no longer individual soldiers shaping battles. It was systems. Industry. Coordination on a scale never seen before. By 1918, warfare had fully entered the modern age, where survival depended less on bravery alone, and more on technology, logistics, and industrial power. Interwar innovation. The guns of the First World War had gone silent. But military technology did not stop evolving. Between the 1920s and 1930s, armies around the world studied the brutal lessons of trench warfare. Commanders realized future conflicts would demand weapons that were lighter, faster, and more adaptable. New ideas began to emerge. Automatic rifles were developed to give individual soldiers greater firepower without relying entirely on heavy machine guns. Submachine guns also gained attention, compact weapons capable of rapid fire in close quarters, especially inside trenches, buildings, and vehicles. The myth is that these weapons suddenly appeared during World War II. In reality, many of the concepts were already being tested years earlier, as nations experimented with mobility and mechanized warfare. Firearms were becoming specialized. Some weapons were designed for long-range precision. Others focused on portability and sustained automatic fire. Military thinkers increasingly imagined battlefields filled with fast-moving infantry, armored vehicles, and coordinated assaults instead of static trench lines. At the same time, manufacturing improved. Weapons could now be produced more efficiently and standardized for massive armies. The world was quietly preparing for another global conflict. And when war returned in 1939, these interwar innovations would shape the next generation of modern combat. World War II designs. The modern battlefield weapon truly began to take shape during World War II. By the late 1930s, nations entered war with lessons learned from trenches, mechanized combat, and industrial warfare. But the scale of the conflict forced firearm design to evolve faster than ever before. Weapons now had to be reliable, easy to mass-produce, and effective across vastly different battlefields, from frozen cities to dense jungles. Submachine guns became widespread for close combat. Semi-automatic rifles gave infantry faster firing capability than traditional bolt-action weapons. And near the end of the war, entirely new concepts began to appear. The German StG-44 is often considered one of the first true assault rifles, combining automatic fire with an intermediate cartridge designed for realistic combat ranges. The myth is that World War II was fought mostly with old bolt-action rifles. In reality, the war became a testing ground for modern infantry weapons, mobile tactics, and industrial standardization on a massive scale. Factories now produced millions of interchangeable parts. Logistics became just as important as firepower. A weapon had to function not only in battle, but also within a global supply system. By 1945, the foundations of modern military firearms were already in place. The next era would simply refine them. Cold War spread. After World War II, the battlefield expanded far beyond Europe. The world entered the Cold War, a global struggle shaped not only by ideology, but by weapons, industry, and influence. The United States and the Soviet Union began exporting firearms to allies across Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. Weapons were no longer confined to the nations that designed them. They became tools of global politics. One rifle could now appear in conflicts thousands of kilometers from its country of origin. The myth is that Cold War weapons spread naturally through popularity alone. In reality, many were distributed through military aid programs, proxy wars, and strategic alliances. Soviet-designed rifles became widespread because they were durable, inexpensive, and easy to mass-produce. Western powers answered with their own systems, supplying allied governments and forces around the world. By the 1960s and 70s, warfare had become deeply interconnected. A conflict in one region often carried the fingerprints of distant superpowers. At the same time, firearm manufacturing became increasingly standardized. Parts, ammunition, and training systems were designed for large-scale global deployment. Weapons were no longer just national inventions. They had become international instruments of modern geopolitics. Modern modular systems. By the late 20th century, firearm design was no longer focused only on raw firepower. It was focused on adaptability. Military planners realized that modern combat could change from open desert, to dense cities, to close-quarters operations within hours. A single weapon now had to serve multiple roles. So firearms became modular. Instead of one fixed design, newer platforms allowed soldiers to swap components, attach optics, change barrel lengths, and mount accessories depending on the mission. The myth is that modern firearms became completely new inventions overnight. In reality, many modern systems evolved from earlier Cold War designs, refined through decades of combat experience and manufacturing improvements. Rail systems, detachable optics, suppressors, adjustable stocks, and interchangeable parts became increasingly common. Weapons could now be customized for range, mobility, or specialized operations without redesigning the entire platform. Reliability also became just as important as accuracy. Modern militaries demanded firearms that could function in sand, mud, snow, and urban environments while remaining lightweight enough for highly mobile infantry. By the early 21st century, the firearm had transformed from a single-purpose weapon into a flexible battlefield system. Not just a rifle, but a platform built to adapt alongside modern warfare. Cultural legacy. Over centuries, firearms became more than battlefield tools. They became symbols. What began as military technology gradually influenced politics, law, art, cinema, and national identity across the world. Different societies viewed firearms in very different ways, as instruments of defense, resistance, authority, independence, or revolution. The myth is that firearms shaped history only through war. In reality, their cultural impact reached far beyond the battlefield. In some countries, firearms became tied to frontier mythology and personal freedom. In others, they became reminders of colonialism, conflict, or state power. Governments built entire legal systems around ownership, control, and public security. At the same time, firearms became deeply embedded in global media. From war photography to Western films, from propaganda posters to modern video games, their image spread through popular culture for generations. The silhouette of a rifle could instantly symbolize rebellion, military strength, or political unrest without a single word being spoken. By the modern era, firearms had become part of humanity's visual language. Not only weapons of war, but objects carrying history, ideology, fear, power, and identity across the world. The history of firearms is really the history of technology, empire, and change. From single-shot weapons to repeating systems. From trench warfare to modular platforms. Each era reflects a shift in how humans fought, organized, and understood power itself. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with friends who enjoy stories like this. Your support helps bring more cinematic history to life.